These are Lightwave's gradient nodes. Gradients are quite a hot little tool in Lightwave and in CG in general, and we're not going to look here in this video at the various huge array of uses that gradients can be put to. There's plenty of tutorials and whatnot out there covering that sort of thing in depth. What we're going to look at instead is how we use these techniques within the nodal implementation of gradients. So to begin with, I want to look at these two guys here just to get them out the way, the thickness and incidence, which are just simple pre-prepared gradients that give you an item's thickness or incidence angle. This is best demonstrated here on something with a bit of shape to it. So here we have straight away our thickness. Let's just hook it into luminosity. And we can see what we basically have is this graduated effect based on the thickness of view. We have an IOR setting, which of course changes the shading that we get out as the rays travelling through our object are bent. Some folks have mentioned using this in things like skin shaders, subsurface scattering, to alter depth and visibility of subsurface layers based on thickness. Personally, I've never been a big fan of it, for the reason that A, you have to start breaking things into layers. Of course you see that because I have the eye geometry and the inside of the mouth inside this object, they're being picked up by it, or I would have to exclude them some other how. And also as your angle of view changes, the thickness result changes quite a bit as well. I mean, if we look at the ears here, from this sort of frontal view, we've got this nice graduated effect as we come out of the ear, but we can see there's sort of a hard edge to it there, and as we rotate around the head we see that that moves along, and that's not going to give us a particularly nice blend effect. So there we go. I prefer to use this node on simple shapes, glass ornaments, stuff like that, where you want a quick, cheap absorption effect or transparency effect, or perhaps using it to drive something else on a similar object, multiplying it via another value to drive the IOR of a transparent object to give different levels of refraction at different depths. Not necessarily very realistic, but it can certainly produce some nice looking effects. Incidence, meanwhile, is just a simple 0 to 1 gradient based on the incidence angle. You can have it read anywhere between 180 and 90 degrees of incidence and switch it either way round, so white is front and black is perpendicular, or alternatively so as black is front and white is perpendicular. And there's no way in the node itself of tweaking the fall-off rate. What you will notice on both nodes, however, are vector and normal inputs. Basically, normal inputs are to input different normals for the surface, and the vector input on the incidence is the vector from which the incidence is being measured. So for instance, if I've got a vector here that's x1, 0, 0 for y and z, and I plug it into vector, then I get incidence to the x-axis as my effect, which in this case appears like side lighting because I'm plugged into luminosity. I could, for instance, plug the same vector into the normal input of the thickness node here, and now the ray that judges the thickness is moving only in the x-axis there. So unless you've got some kind of specialist setup perhaps where you're using multiple levels of normal maps, usually from ZBrush or something, for inner detailed surfaces, then you won't be using these inputs that much. So with those guys covered, let's have a look at our regular old gradient nodes here, and we're going to start with the old familiar one that we know and love. Okay, and here we go. The input, of course, we can select an input for the gradient, and basically the input is looked at in the range that we enter in these boxes here. The output are the values that we assign to the keys. So for instance here, my input is x coordinate, got 0 to 1, if I make 1 white, and so what we get is at 0 meters or below, because even though we're not looking at the range, the gradient itself effectively just extends off to infinity. So anything 0 and below black, anything 1 or above on x is white. There you go, nice and simple. Or perhaps it isn't white at all, maybe it's hot pink. Basically whatever colour we choose to give it, whatever value. We also have alpha, because these colours can also output an alpha. Often if you're just wanting a gradient to drive a simple 0 to 1, rather than putting in black and white values and using the colour or splitting the colour, it's often just as easy to use the alpha. So if I were to unhook your colour and say that your alpha here at 0 was 0% and at 1 remained 100, which is equivalent to 1, then hooking the alpha output scalar into something like luminosity would give me that effect. 0% luminous through 100% luminous. And so of course really what the gradient is a remapping tool. A user tweakable function, essentially, to apply to almost anything. And as was said in the remapping video, gradient is therefore fundamental to remapping, because it lets you convert almost anything to anything else. Like here, the x-coordinate is converted to luminosity, and it lets you set the range. For instance, here I've used alpha to go from 0 to 1. This could be 3 meters on the x, and so I've remapped 0 to 3 as 0 to 1, and so on. And of course, because we're in nodal, this input can receive any scalar, which means it can be driven by any number of other things, which makes the gradient suddenly massively powerful. Here's something quite common, using a gradient as a kind of a color tool. If I input the background color from the image here and hook it over, well, that's going a bit wrong because of what I've got on here. I'm just going to set that back to white there, bring that key's alpha there back up to 100, take that back to position 1, set my range here to 1. Okay, at the minute, obviously, I'm still running the input of x coordinate, and this is my foreground, so it's laying on top of my background. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the luma, which is the brightness of the color values in the image there, and I'm going to use that as the input for the gradient. Of course, what we see is that as the luma inputs total black, the gradient outputs total black. As it inputs total white, the gradient outputs total white. So we basically get the luma replicated. We can invert it and get the negative. We can punch in a middle key here and start giving ourselves a contrast control, like that. Okay? That's fun, but of course what gets more fun is when we start messing around with the blending modes here. So of course if I set this to, say, multiply, then where the luma is black, I'm multiplying by 0. Where the luma is 1, I'm multiplying by 1. And so this gives me this harsh contrasted image, where the blacks get darkened and the lights remain the same. Again, I can throw a little contrast control in this way. Of course, I could set that to be white there, in which case I've just got the original image as if I hadn't pumped it through the gradient at all. But I can then start playing. Quick way to do this is just to right click to get an HSV and then work with the V here. So I can change the output white and of course the output black. I can throw in middle keys, throw adjustments in just the mid-tone, move that about through the tone, and so on. And then of course you've got all your other blending modes available to you. So by choosing darken, I can grab the light inputs here and apply darkening to the whites and do all sorts of stuff. So all of these sorts of things that we're used to, like brightness and contrast and saturation and tone mapping and everything else, really are just different curves that we apply to the brightness of the pixels of a given image, or of course to their color. And so using a gradient in this fashion means that you can do the same things, not just with image maps, but of course with any kind of color texture, from procedurals or anything else, or whole networks, and tweak and remap those, and take any number of different inputs. So that's lovely, but there's other stuff that we can do with gradients as well, such as, for instance, I'm going to switch to y coordinate here. So I'm going to put my gradient on the up-down here, in this kind of a fashion, and I'm going to make quite a tight-ish line there, because here's the other thing I can use gradients for, and that's to produce masks. So we see here I've taken two procedurals into a mixer, one is the background, one is the foreground, and I'm just using the 0,1 value of the color channel here. Obviously that'll be the red channel. I could have used alpha had I entered values for alpha instead of these values here, but I'm using that to drive a mixer node, and so my gradient is effectively a mask for these two textures, materials, whatever else. This can be useful in all sorts of situations, when you've got things running down walls, or dust only on the tops of surfaces, or a gradation between two things based on the angle of incidence to view. Any number of things you can mask. And it's very quick and it's very easy, but it's also very clean. I'm basing on just a single coordinate here, and even with a good blend distance between them, there's not a lot of messing up. It is of course a very straight, flat blend, because it's just basing itself off a single coordinate. But we can perturb these, because if we hit the show outputs for any of them, then we get key connection outputs for those things, which means I didn't even need to go this way at all. I could have gone this way instead, and just fed the textures directly into the key colors. Now what I enter in here, even though you'll notice I can still change it, it makes no difference to the output anymore. It outputs these color values at each key. Again, I could have driven the output alpha values in the same way by connecting things to the alpha connections. But the one that's interesting when it comes to masks is the position connections, because of course these keys have a position value of where they are on the input range, and I can drive that nodally too. So, for instance, I could say that these are the rough positions I want my keys to be at, so I'll take a couple of scalars here and just note them down. So key 1 here is 0.1177, just like that, and key 2 here is 0.7855. Okay, that's all good. I can grab me, let's say, a spot info to get the x coordinate of this surface. I can bring out my old friend sine here to get the sine of each of those x values. Bring out a pair of scalar adds, so as I can add those two scalars to the result of sine and plug those into the positions. And we can see that the position of the key at each spot on the surface is the sine of the x coordinate. If I wanted to increase the frequency, of course, then I'd multiply my initial x, and I'd get stuff like that. So what you can do with the gradients here in Node Editor is start displacing the keys around based on things. So when you want to create these graduated masks that run from top to bottom, you don't have to stick with a perfectly straight line that's just based on the one axis or something else. You can bring other things into the mix. You know, you could be taking vectors from a null in your scene and plugging those into position, making a gradient follow a null as you drag it around. Something of that nature. So there we go, lots of tricks, and we could go on and on and on and on and on. But of course, doubtlessly, we will see plenty of uses of gradients throughout these tutorials. So we'll leave that regular fella there alone, and come and check out the curve gradient node, which is awesome. It's basically the exact same thing. Look, you've got a background color input, blending mode, an input selection, and so on, value, position, and channels for red, green, blue, and alpha, just as you effectively have here. But rather than just having this simple color scale, we're able to plot the gradient on a graph. So let's just hook up the alpha value there to the luminosity. So I'm going to key the alpha channel. You can key the channels separately, or you can just Control Shift multi-select them as you do, and key them all at once by selecting their keys and whatnot. Manipulate them when you select their keys. But for our demonstration here, we're just going to go with alpha. The first thing to note in the curve gradient when we use it is that the axis along the bottom here represents the input value, and the axis along the top represents the output value. So here I'm set to x coordinate. I've got alpha plugged to luminosity. Here's my key, so presently at x0 luminosity is 1. Pick up my key tool here, then somewhere around, let's say 0.5, I'll bring it down to nothing, and then over here at 1, I'll take it back up to 1 again. And there we see that's my 0.5 dip there. Obviously this plane is much bigger than 1 meter, and obviously enough your input range goes off as far as you're needing or wanting it to. Thing to be careful about in here is when you've got one of these tools selected. This is the drag key tool there, which drags it up and down only, will not drag it side to side, unless you hold control, in which case it's side to side only, like regular graph editor. But to select keys, you need to actually click it to drop the tool. Unlike graph editor, it's easy to forget to drop it and, oh god, I just created another key, stupid. And then you've got to go along and delete that key. Shift F will fit your range, incidentally. The thing that's great about this, of course, is that you can really design the curve. Because if we select some keys there, we can set what curve type they are, including Bezier. And of course we can, drag their handles to manipulate them. This little thing, lock CP, unlocks the handles, and we can toggle that for multiple keys at once, whether they're locked or unlocked. And that really basically is it for you. You will notice that selecting these keys here, there's no sign of any show output, so there's no way to plug nodes into what the keys are. But notice that their value and positions can be enveloped. So you can animate them should you want, including, let's not forget, using a nodal channel filter. And just like usual, you can always remove it if you want. So that basically is the curve gradient node. It's really quite useful because it allows you to build more elaborate graduated curves that are harder to do with the key and smooth settings that you find here. But here's one great thing that the curve also comes in handy for, and that goes back to what we were just talking about with the regular gradient and its node connection inputs. Let's say we forget this whole sine business here that I've done. What if I take my curve here, use the x coordinate as its input, and use the alpha value that I've keyed here, and add that on to those key positions instead? My goodness, look what we're seeing. And this is going to be far easier to see if we just go back to plain black and white there. Check it out. Look, my curve is displacing my gradient. Let's add some more keys. And there you go. You see what we're getting? We're able to truly draw out the kind of gradient behavior that we want here by manipulating this curve. So loads of opportunities for really fun stuff like that. So there we go. These are the gradient nodes and how we use the good old tricks of gradients that we've been used to for years, specifically in their nodal incarnations.